Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here from the Writ.ca, and welcome to this new episode of the Writ Show. So as we have done over the last few episodes, we're going to take a look at where the polls are right now, and the numbers are pretty big for the Liberal Party right now. And if you had asked me, would one party win 200 seats at the beginning of the year, I would have said, yeah, probably. I think a party would win 200 seats in the 2025 election. Except right now, that party isn't the Conservative Party, it is the Liberals. So let's take a look at where the poll tracker stands right now. This is the aggregation of all the polls that are out there that I'm publishing for the CBC. Again, this is the model that I have used now for the last few elections. Now, if we look at where things stand across the country, it is a big lead for the Liberals. They now are at just over 43% support, and we've seen that actually tick up over the last few days. They went first over 40, then over 41, and now they're at 43%. The Liberals haven't gotten this much support in elections since the days of Pierre Trudeau. So it would be a big shift if this is actually what happens. The Conservatives are at 37.4%, so they've really been stuck somewhere between that 37 and 38% for the last, really since the beginning of the campaign. So the fact that the Liberals have moved ahead is not due to a Conservative slide. It is because the Liberals are picking up support from the New Democrats, from the Bloc Québécois, a little bit from the Greens, and it's just pushing them forward. So the Conservatives are holding steady, but the Liberals keep moving further ahead. The NDP is just in a lot of trouble right now. They're at 8.5% on average. We saw a series of polls that were published just yesterday and this morning, and had the NDP between 6 and 10% support. The worst performance the NDP has ever gotten was just a little bit over 6% in 1993. We haven't seen a lot of polls putting the NDP below that level. We have seen a few sixes, so it is possible that the NDP could actually be on track for its worst result ever. So that is one of the reasons why we're seeing the Liberals so far ahead, that they are now opening up a lead of 6 points in the polls over the Conservatives, is largely due to that vote having migrated over from the NDP, and as I said, also a little bit from the Bloc Québécois, that is now at just under 6% nationally. We'll get into the Quebec numbers in a minute. Now, in terms of the seat projections, 203 for the Liberals, 203. I would not have expected that I would be projecting those kinds of results for the Liberals even a month ago, let alone 2 or 3 months ago. It is just an incredible number to see that the Liberals are actually at over 200 seats. That's what the polls are talking about, and that's just the kind of results that you have to get with the kind of numbers we're seeing in the polls. The Conservatives right now are projected to win 116 seats. The Bloc Québécois is projected to win 20, the NDP 3, the Greens 1, and no other seats for either Independents or the People's Party. Now, if we do look at the likely ranges, which takes into account more normal polling errors, normal projection errors, you can see that the Liberals are still well above the majority threshold. You need 172 seats to win a majority government, and the likely range puts the Liberals between 180 and 214. So in the likely outcome, which is based on what we would expect the polls to produce in a normal election, the Liberals are still in majority territory across the board. Even if they underperform, they still end up above that 172 seat mark if the election were held today. Where things will be on April 28th, we'll see. You're going to have to keep watching, and I'll update you on the numbers, but this is what it would look like right now. The Conservatives would win between 108 and 133 seats. So it's still more or less where they were in the last election. The Bloc is down to 16 to 23. They won 32 seats in the last election, so that is a pretty big slide. And 1 to 10 for the NDP. If some of their incumbents do outperform expectations, then you do potentially get a scenario where the NDP ends up closer to that 10 mark than to that 3 mark that they're currently sitting at. But it is largely a two-horse race. When we look at the odds of winning, it's now an 85% chance that if the election were held today, the Liberals would win a majority government. 85%. At the end of the 2021 election, their odds of winning a majority in this same model was somewhere around 15%. And of course, they didn't win one. But they're actually at 85 now. So it shows how the numbers have shifted so much that in 2021, the close race we saw in the polls suggested that a majority government was unlikely. Now the kind of numbers that we see suggest a majority government is likely. That if we did end up voting tomorrow, the best guess of the outcome would be a Liberal majority government. There is still a chance that the Liberals could fall short of that, an 11% chance that they could win a minority. But right now, the model only shows a 2% chance that if the election were held today, the Conservatives would actually win the most seats. There's a number of reasons for that, but it's as simple as this. The Conservatives won the popular vote by about a percentage point in both the 2019 and 2021 elections. In both of those elections, they were 40 seats behind the Liberals, 40-ish seats. So if they're not only 1 point ahead, but they're 6 points behind, you're not going to win. It's just as simple as that. For the Conservatives to win more seats than the Liberals, they probably need to be ahead by at least 3 points nationwide, probably more in the 4 to 5 point range. So not only do the polls need to be wrong about the Liberals leading, they need to be wrong to the extent that not only are the Liberals not leading by 5 points, the Conservatives need to be leading by 5 points. That's a huge error to see in a national polling climate. You rarely see the polls miss an election by that much in Canada, at least at the national level. So that is why the model does not see really a path for the Conservatives with the kind of numbers that we're seeing today. And a lot of it is the regional breakdown. We'll start at Western Canada, as we usually do. 43% right now for the Liberals in British Columbia. 39 for the Conservatives, just 12 for the NDP. Conservatives can win a lot of seats with the kind of vote they have, but the Liberals are going to pick up a lot of those NDP seats in the Lower Mainland and on Vancouver Island with these kinds of numbers. This kind of two-horse race in British Columbia we haven't seen in a while. It's usually a pretty close three-way, 3.5-way race with the Greens, but even the Greens have been falling out of contention. It's not a two-horse race in Alberta. It's still largely a one-horse race, but it is 55% for the Conservatives, 30 for the Liberals, and just under 10 for the NDP. So the Liberals, with the kind of support that they've grown, they've doubled their support since the last election, should be competitive in some seats in Edmonton and in Calgary. While the Conservatives would still win by far the most seats in Alberta, the Liberals are poised to make a few gains in the province. Out in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, seeing the Conservatives at 50%, so still lots of support for them there, 31.5 for the Liberals and 14 for the NDP. From the polling that we've seen within the prairies, Saskatchewan does seem to be pretty solid for the Conservatives. We did see one poll that came out this past week suggesting that the race might be close in Saskatoon, really close. We'll see if that plays out. It doesn't quite line up with all the numbers that we've seen out of the region. And the numbers that we've seen in Manitoba suggest that it's probably a pretty close race across the province as a whole, but the Liberals do seem to be doing pretty well in Winnipeg, where they could pick off not only a few seats from the NDP, but even potentially a few seats from the Conservatives. Over in Ontario, the gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives continues to increase. Right now, it's 48% support for the Liberals against 38.5% for the Conservatives, so nearly a 10-point gap between the two. That gives the Liberals a huge seat advantage in Ontario, not only probably poised to sweep Toronto again. The NDP only has 8% support in Toronto. In Ontario, I should say. They had a poll recently, and we'll get into that in a bit, that had them in single digits in Toronto itself. But the Liberals well positioned to win in the GTA and parts of southwestern Ontario, parts of Hamilton, parts of northern Ontario, eastern Ontario. It's just looking with these kinds of numbers that the Liberals could win a huge amount of seats in Ontario unless things turn around. And then out in Quebec, the Liberals again are moving further ahead, 42% in Quebec. That is a huge score for them. We haven't seen those kinds of numbers in a long time. The Bloc Québécois is down to 25%. The Conservatives holding their own at 22%, and the NDP is only at 6% support. Again, this should deliver many seats to the Liberals if they can hold this vote, because a lot of the transference has been from the Bloc Québécois to the Liberals. So a lot of seats in the province that are currently held by the Bloc, you would put the Liberals as the favorites. And then finally in Atlantic Canada, big lead for the Liberals. They're now at 56% across the region. The Conservatives are at 33%, should still be able to be in contention in the seats that they hold, but it doesn't look like this is a region that is going to swing blue, which is what it looked like it was going to be just a few months ago. So you put together these numbers for the Liberals. Big advantage in Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, potential to win many new seats in BC and in Alberta and Manitoba. It's that solid majority government for the Liberals right now of over 200 seats. That is what the numbers are showing right now. As hard as it is to believe, after everything that has moved over the last little while, that is what the numbers are suggesting is the most likely outcome if the election were held today. Now, I want to take a look a little bit at the trend lines, which you can do on the poll tracker at the more at the bottom of the page, and we can try to focus in again on the last little bit. This is just going back to the end of February. And you can see that the Liberals are continuing to pick up. And it's largely because the NDP is falling. The Conservatives have dropped a little bit since the beginning of the campaign, but not very much. They've been holding pretty steady. It's instead that the Liberals are gaining on the Conservatives because of the drop in NDP support. And you can see this in pretty much every region of the country. We can go through them again. You can see that the Liberals are now moving ahead in British Columbia, getting a lot of support from the NDP. In Alberta, We see the same thing where the Liberals are starting to close the gap on the Conservatives, again, thanks to drop in support for the NDP. If we look in the prairies, they're not seeing as much movement over the last little while. The Liberals might be stabilizing a little bit of where they have been over the last few days. In Ontario, Liberals continuing to widen the gap between them and the Conservatives, in part, again, because of that drop for the NDP. In Quebec, we see that the Liberals are just surging forward as they pick up support from the Bloc primarily. And then finally, Atlantic Canada, still seeing that trend line being quite positive for the Liberals as they approach Election Day. Now, what I also wanted to talk about was some of the numbers we saw in some polls that came out just over the last day. One of them was from the Angus Reid Institute. This is a big poll, had an 8-point lead for the Liberals across the country, which is one of the better numbers we've seen for the Liberals, but by no means out of the ordinary nowadays. And you can see that in the poll on the left of it, here I'll hover over it with my cursor here, you see the national numbers. In this Angus Reid Institute poll, 46 Liberal, 38 Conservative, 7 NDP, 7 Bloc. But they had a breakdown by cities and metropolitan regions. In Vancouver, the Liberals are leading with 53% support, 29 for the Conservatives, 14 for the NDP, and that is a big problem for the New Democrats, considering that a big chunk of their caucus actually was elected in the Metro Vancouver area. In Toronto, 59% for the Liberals, 29 for the Conservatives, 9 for the NDP. Toronto currently has only one seat that isn't Liberal. That's Toronto St. Paul's, which the Liberals lost to the Conservatives in a by-election last year. It was a big watershed by-election, started the problems for the Liberals and Justin Trudeau in terms of his own leadership. With these kinds of numbers, it looks like the Liberals are going to sweep Toronto again. The NDP might have had a chance when Trudeau was still leader to make some gains in downtown core, the central, the old town, the old city of Toronto. 9% isn't going to cut it. And then you see in Toronto 905, this is the huge swath of ridings around Toronto itself down into the Niagara Peninsula. 59% for the Liberals, 37% for the Conservatives, 2% for the NDP. That's the reason why the Liberals are so high. But if it's a 22-point lead for the Liberals in the GTA, that is going to be a near sweep for the Liberals. Finally, they also have some numbers in Montreal, and they show that the Liberals have a 30-point lead in Montreal over the Bloc Québécois. So the Liberals are in a good position to retain their seats and gain some seats in and around the city of Montreal. Should point out, these samples are relatively small. They're all somewhere between 167 to 200. So the margin of error is pretty large on that, but nevertheless, these are huge gaps. These are such big gaps that the margin of error really doesn't matter that much. Okay, we got some questions, and I had asked for some questions last week. I'm going to try to answer usually one or two if I can in these episodes. You can leave them in the comments, and the YouTube algorithm is able to identify when there's questions, so I'm trying my best. Some of them might have been missed. Anyway, there's this question I got from Laser Lorne 2670. I've gotten a variation of this question and seen this comment a lot on YouTube, on other social media, and Laser Lorne says, "It is amazing that Carney gets so few people out to his rallies and yet is so high in the polls. Are the polls correct?" So there's been this contrast between these huge rallies that Pierre Poilievre is putting together, sometimes several thousand people, with the relatively, or at least in comparison, smaller rallies that are being put on by Mark Carney. Some of the rallies have been of decent size for Carney, so I don't think it should be exaggerated that no one's showing up to those rallies. But it's clear that the Pierre Poilievre ones are much, much bigger. The first thing to point out is that Conservatives have been pretty good at getting these big rallies for a while. Right? We saw that they had these big rallies back when they were ahead by 20, 25 points. So the party knows how to put these together. Okay, so that's just one thing to think about. But the other thing to think about is this giving some indication that we should doubt the polls? I got to tell you, anecdotal kind of stuff like this only tells such a small part of the story. Yes, a lot of people can show up at rallies. That means that the base is enthused. That's good news for the Conservatives. But it doesn't mean that the polls are wrong, because Conservative base right now, they're at 37, 38% support in the polls. That is better than last time. It is better than every election since 2011. So the Conservative base has grown. So they should be able to get bigger rallies. But the Conservatives doing well at rallies does not equate to the polls being wrong. In part because we're seeing these poll numbers from every single pollster that is now published over the last week or so has either a tie or a lead of 8 points or more. There's no pollster that we've seen now over the last little while that has the Conservatives ahead. All these polls are being done by different pollsters with Some of them with really good track records, some of them with less good track records. Some of them have been around for 20, 30 years. Some of them have been around for only a couple elections. Some of them are using interactive voice response, so that automated polling where you just get a call on your phone and you enter the numbers on your touch screen. Some of them are using online panels. So they're these pre-existing panels that include hundreds of thousands of Canadians, and they are polled from at regular intervals. Some are using live telephone callers, so they're the old-fashioned way of people dialing up, talking to you on the phone, asking, who you're going to vote for. Some of them are polling by text message. Some of them are combining these methods, and they're all finding the same thing. If there was a problem with the polls, we would see at least one of these methods finding that the Conservatives are actually still way ahead or something like that. When you see this kind of consensus across all these different polling firms, and I know some people try to think whether this pollster is a liberal pollster, this pollster is a conservative pollster. I don't really buy any of that. But generally speaking, when you got it from this many pollsters, we're talking like a dozen, you're going to get a mix of those kind of perspectives. So I think that the numbers that we've seen in the polls give us a good reason to believe that the Liberals are far ahead. Pierre Poilievre's base is motivated, and I think they're going to go out and vote in big numbers. But when you're in the midst of a big kind of wave election where the Liberals are gaining this amount of support in the polls, those are people that are not necessarily going to show up at a rally, but it does matter if they show up to vote. You can think about the 2011 election in Quebec. The New Democrats had zero organization. In some cases, they were being outspent tens of thousands of dollars in an individual riding by the Bloc Québécois, and the Bloc probably could put together some rallies. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. The Bloc was just swept out of there, and the NDP was winning places they had no business of winning. They had never competed at all in those ridings. When there's something happening, those kinds of considerations kind of go out the window. So I think that for people who see these polls and wonder, like, well, all my friends went to this rally for Pierre Poilievre, and there was a huge lot of energy there. You got to remember that we're talking about millions and millions and millions of voters. And in a big metropolitan area, the Conservatives have a lot of engaged supporters who will go out to a rally. All the people at a rally won't even elect a single MP. We're talking about needing tens of thousands of votes, hundreds of thousands of votes in a city in order to win multiple seats. So the polls should be at least ballpark correct. They shouldn't be wrong enough with these kinds of numbers and the consensus we've seen across them, that secretly the Conservatives are leading and it's not showing up in the polls. We're not in that scenario. The gap is too big. I also got this question from Ruben Pilley, 6549. And the question asks about the shy conservative hypothesis. And he goes on to talk a little bit about it. So this is the notion that historically conservative voters are less likely to talk to pollsters and tell them that they're going to vote for the Conservatives, because there's supposed to be this perception that it is an unpopular thing to support the Conservative Party. The reason that this theory exists is that this was from an election in the United Kingdom in the 90s, where the Conservative government was really unpopular. There was polling that showed that the UK Tories were going to lose that election, and in the end they did fine. So there was the idea that a lot of people, when they were being called by pollster, were secretly planning to vote for the United Kingdom Tories, but didn't want to admit it. This has been kind of debunked in subsequent studies that this doesn't actually exist. This is called social desirability bias, that when you're talking to a pollster, you'll feel like you should say what you think the person wants to hear on the phone, that you don't want to express an unpopular opinion. I doubt actually the contention that people who vote for the Conservatives are ashamed of it and don't want to admit it to people. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of people don't have that feeling. But also it's a theory that's kind of out of date. In the early 1990s, polling was done over the telephone. You had to actually talk to someone. There's a human being you were speaking to. So maybe you felt like you had to say whatever the person wanted to hear. But nowadays, polling is largely done automated, telephone, or online. So you're not dealing with anybody. You're dealing with an AI voice, or you're dealing with an internet platform. So there shouldn't really be any social desirability bias or any reason to think that if you're ashamed to vote for whatever party, that you're not telling the robot on the other end of the phone or the internet panel. So I don't think that this is a real thing. What I think is a real thing is that some conservative voters can be harder to reach. We did see that in the US elections, where people who were voting for Donald Trump were a bit harder to find and get in touch with, and pollsters have struggled to try to do that. But in my experience in Canada, a lot of those voters tend to be in areas that are rural areas that already vote for the Conservatives in huge numbers. So while if they're not showing up in the polls, it might give the Conservatives a couple extra points in the national numbers, it doesn't actually win them any extra seats If they're going to win Saskatchewan with 60% in the projections, but they actually win with 70% in rural Saskatchewan, it doesn't matter. They were already going to win all those seats. So I don't think that the shy conservative effect is a real thing. I do think there might be a less good ability to reach some of those voters. But I'll go back to my previous point with the previous question. That might be worth a couple points. It's not going to be worth 5, 6, and certainly not the 10 that the Conservatives need right now in order to get into a position where they would win the most seats. Okay, well, that'll be it for this episode of The Writ Show. If you have some questions that you'd like me to answer for the next episode, you can leave them in the comments. And again, I'll try to get to one or two that I can answer and that I think at least the answer will be interesting. So thanks so much for watching. And if you haven't already, you can like and subscribe to this channel. I'll have a new episode of the Writ podcast out on Wednesday. The Numbers will be back on Thursday. The Writ Show will be back on Friday. So until then, thanks for watching.